All right, so Dan Crenshaw went on CNN, and Dana Bash is going to really press him on supporting new gun safety reforms. And, man, he ain't budging on almost anything at all. So this is a really interesting back and forth. Let's take a look.
John Cornyn, he's taking the lead on negotiations for new gun legislation. One option being discussed is a red flag law. I'm sure you know that Rick Scott actually signed one into law when he was Florida governor after the Parkland shooting. Would you vote yes on a national red flag law?
No, I wouldn't. It's funny, Rick Scott cited the law. You would think from the trolls on the internet that I'm the #1 advocate for red flag laws. That's a bit of a myth perpetuated by my own side.
No, he had a tweet from years ago where he did advocate for a red flag law. And so I don't know why he's not, saying, hey, I changed my position on this, I'm now against it. I don't know why he's not saying that. He's pretending like he never took that position when he did take that position. So very confusing, very dishonest, very weird, because we can just check your Twitter, bro. We know that you previously advocated for this. He's a weird guy.
Now, truthfully, I think there's a lot of problems with red flag laws, especially at a national level. And when it comes to criminal law, that really should be democratically decided at the local and state level. But even so, you have to look at these.
I never understood that argument, man. I never understood the argument of like, no, it's better to just leave it to the states. When it comes to, and he even said when it comes to criminal law, why? Murder's wrong in all 50 states. Grand larceny is wrong in all 50 states. So I don't understand that logic. Yeah, well, they think different things in Wisconsin than they do in New York. Okay, but I think the things that are objectively immoral in New York are objectively immoral in Wisconsin, and vice versa. Things that are moral in New York are moral in Wisconsin, or they should be, with reasonable standards. But, it's the classic Republican, like, states' rights argument, and we all know how that idea has been used and abused over the years to allow red states to do super immoral things. Anyway.
I wonder what the actual
Would you support a red flag law in Texas?
Well, no, and here's why. Because what we're essentially trying to do with the red flag law is enforce the law before the law has been broken. And that's a really difficult thing to do. It's difficult to assess whether somebody is a threat. Now, if there's such a threat that they're threatening somebody with a weapon already, well, then they've already broken the law, so why do you need this other law? That's the question that I think critics rightfully ask about these things. And so it's really unclear, one, how they're properly enforced, how due process is adhered to, and then ultimately how they even solve the problem. Because these things have to be reported for them to actually matter. And in this case, look, you have a troubled teenager who did some very strange things, some shooting at people with BB guns, cutting himself, saying crazy things. Does this reach the level where you involuntarily commit him or take his property? Because the thing is those things that this teenager was doing could be applied to quite a few teenagers.
Right. I mean, there's a big gulf, I think anybody would argue, between committing somebody and allowing him to buy a weapon of war legally in Texas.
Yeah, I think Dana Bash is right about that. Look, red flag laws, they make sense because if somebody is really showing erratic behavior, unbalanced behavior, they're showing that they're mentally off, they're doing self-harm, they're harming others, they're harming animals, in many instances with a lot of these shootings, in the weeks leading up to the shooting, they'll be like online saying, I'm going to do a mass shooting. And the argument in favor of red flag laws is like, well, that stuff matters, and that is enough to confiscate the weapons from these people. I would have a hard time disagreeing with that. Now, one of the counter arguments is, people would say, yeah, but since no crime has been committed, you can't punish them. But they're not getting locked up in jail, and they're not getting locked up in prison. Oh, but it violates due process. No, the due process will be when you're determining whether or not they get to keep their guns. There will be a process set up. It could be done by a court. It could be done by a regulatory body where all the evidence is presented, and then they make a quick decision. Okay, no, this person's a little too off to own weapons. Like, Dan Crenshaw brings it up, like, this is a troubling behavior that a lot of teens exhibit. And it's like, okay, well, none of those teens should be allowed to have guns. Now, if it's a different set of circumstances, and it's somebody who has no mental health issues and isn't doing self-harm or harming others and isn't saying things like, I'm going to kill people now, well, then that's different. And then they should be allowed to have their weapon. But we're talking about whether or not we should be allowed to take into consideration completely erratic behavior when it comes to owning a firearm. And common sense dictates, well, absolutely that should be part of it. Absolutely. Just like when it comes to our universal background check system, I'm in favor of a one strike and you're out type deal. So in other words, if there's anything questionable or spotty on your record, you're not allowed to buy it. You're not allowed to buy it. And people, well, what if that's discriminatory? And okay, it is discriminatory, and that's fine. Because when it comes to owning a weapon, we should be discriminatory. Absolutely. Oh, but don't stigmatize people with mental health. Look, I have nothing but endless sympathy for people that have mental health issues, but they need to get help and they need to not own weapons. Now, you could say, oh, that's too black and white, and that, okay, fine, so be it. So we crack down a little too hard, and then what? The end result is fewer dead bodies. I'm not in favor of taking, guns from, people who can pass a test and can show that they're responsible enough to own the weapon, but I would have a very strict system set up where, you try to make sure the guns don't get into the wrong hands. And he's against that. He's against a red flag law. He's against this idea of having some sort of process set up where evidence is presented where it's like, this person's a little too off to have their firearms now. So anyway, they continue. Let's go.
I mean, if you change the law,
this gets to a solution maybe we could agree on then.
Okay.
Well, so maybe a solution we could agree on is improving our background check system because, again...
Yeah, but you could do that and a red flag law. Definitely.
He went through a background check. So the problem isn't that a red flag law could have solved this. It doesn't seem clear that...
It could have solved it. It could have solved it. Now, again, the only blind spot that you have is like, will people actually report the troubling behavior, right? But he did so much troubling stuff that, like, if somebody had the option, they probably would have reported it. I mean, he did a lot of crazy stuff. He cut his face repeatedly. People saw that and were like, they had a nickname for him, and it was School Shooter because he gave people that creepy vibe. He contacted a number of people and he said, I'm going to go shoot up a school. And I think he did it even before the day of. When he did the day of, he did it on like Instagram or something. I think he did it like the week before on Facebook or something like that. So should there be a system set up where that person can be reported and then there's the process and then you could take their weapons? Yeah, I think so. He's saying, no, don't do that, but just have a better background check system. Well, I agree with the better background check system, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you could do a red flag law too.
That would have happened. The problem is that the background check didn't capture the full story of this person. And so, look, the Republicans are the ones that proposed and passed the Fix NICS Act. Republicans have proposed the 21st Century Fix NICS Act, which further improves the system. Mm-hmm. It's the NRA that actually advocated.
Yeah, but these guys are for the gun show loophole, which is a way around background checks when you purchase weapons. So I don't understand. I don't understand. He's acting like, no, Republicans are for tougher background checks. Yeah, well, then why is it they won't vote for a universal background check bill if it was proposed today? Why wouldn't it be 100-0 in the Senate? Because they're not actually for universal background checks.
For background checks in the first place. Because, look, gun owners do want law-abiding citizens to have guns. Would you expand it? Would you make a universal background check? Well, no. So people have to understand universal...
That was great from Dana Batch. She called him speeding there completely. He's like, we need tougher, better background check systems. And, we propose this law. We propose that law. And Dana's like, well, what about universal? And he's like, no, not universal. What? Why? He's going to explain now, and I think it's a shitty explanation.
Background checks mean. That means that I can no longer sell a gun to my friend. If my neighbor, let's say her husband is gone for the week and she wants to borrow my gun, that would make us both felons. That's the problem with universal background checks. And the people who are least likely to adhere to universal background check are the criminals who intend harm. So again, it's an outcome problem. I don't think
so maybe not in those, right.
Yeah, but I find that silly. So like when my dad passed away in 2011, he had a whole bunch of firearms. He had a whole bunch of weapons. And I was legally allowed to just take them and own them and they're mine. Shouldn't there be a situation where, like, they don't know if I'm fucking crazy. They don't know if I'm going to murder people. They don't know if I'm off. So why shouldn't there be a system where it's like, no, you actually do have to pass some sort of a training or a background check in order to get those weapons? The idea that that's like, it's crazy to make somebody do that. Why? Why is that crazy? That's not crazy at all. In fact, I would argue the opposite is crazy. If you just let me have them, Yeah, it's easy. Yeah, it's convenient. But, what if I was this psycho kid from Texas? Then everybody be like, why didn't we have the check system for when he got the guns from his dad? Right? So it's just not a convincing counter
I
argument.
understand there's so many real world scenarios that are hard to police, so to speak. What about the gun show loophole? That's a very real situation that happens
Well, that's
on a
the same
regular
thing as the
basis.
universal.
People buy a gun at a
Well,
no.
Right.
I mean, it's
There's
a
nothing
specific
particular about a
example.
gun
You're at a
show.
gun show and you buy a gun
Right.
should there be a background check involved in that purchase?
Well, there is. So there's nothing particular about gun shows that actually there's a loophole for. When people say the gun show loophole, they're talking about private transfers, which gets back to the universal background check debate. Okay. So there's nothing specific in law about a gun show that allows people to do more things than they would otherwise be able to do. Dealers at gun shows make you go through a background check if you buy a gun.
That's not always true.
Congressman, let's get to a couple of other issues because there's so many potential solutions, and I want to hear
sure.
other ones that you potentially agree with. One is raise the minimum age to purchase a firearm to 21 years old. The shooter in Uvalde, he was only 18. The Buffalo shooter was 18. Sandy Hook shooter was 20 years old. Parkland was 19 years old. Should you be 21 to buy a gun?
Well, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, should 21 be the age that you're an adult? As a society, we do have to decide.
I actually do kind of agree with his response here, to be fair. Because, one thing I've never liked is the total disparity in when you're legally allowed to do various things, right? And it varies in states, too. It varies from state to state. So, there's a certain age you're allowed to drink alcohol, 21. There's a certain age you're allowed to join the military. It's much younger than that. There's a certain age you're allowed to drive. There's a certain age you're allowed to buy a lotto ticket or buy cigarettes. And, everything ranges from, 16 all the way up to 21. And I don't like how we arbitrarily decide for each different thing, it's this line or it's that line. I think we should collectively as a society, not state by state, but federally, pick one age and say everything over this. That's when you're, in the eyes of the law, an adult. And it's tough because you have to balance everything, right? You have to balance all the different things that you're allowing a kid to do when they become an adult. But I really do think you should pick one line and do it from there. I don't agree with having so many different lines for it.
When you're technically an adult. And right now, we technically say 18. Well, look, I'm not very impressed by our current swath of 18-year-olds and their maturity level. So maybe we should have that conversation.
Yeah, but I'm not impressed with our 56-year-olds' maturity levels. So that's not really relevant.
But then it has to apply broadly. It has to mean that you are not an adult until 21. And then, what happens then? When we see a 22-year-old commit an atrocity, are we going to raise it again? And are we going to raise it again? And at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves what our limiting principle is as far as that age limit.
Well, I mean,
the vast majority
the
of
NIH
these
has
horrible
said that
shootings.
I mean, look, he's being Weasley because he doesn't support any real gun reforms, so this is kind of a BS answer. But at the same time, substantively, I don't think he's wrong on this part of his answer.
Teenage brain isn't finished developing until mid-20s. There's medical studies that show that the teenage brain just isn't fully developed.
That's true. And does that mean that I think it's 26, actually. And so does that mean you're not an adult until 26? I mean, I think I was on my second deployment by then. So.
You shouldn't have been, bro. Nobody should have been on deployment to Iraq.
These are hard questions. And we're grasping for an answer because this is an atrocity that really hits our hard.
Congressman, I think, I'm guessing there are a lot of people out there watching this, hearing you saying no to a lot of the solutions that people are talking about. So what I think people want to know is, what is the solution? What would you agree with? Because the way that the answers are coming out now, it's that nothing's going to change. And I don't think people here in this community and across the country want to hear that after their babies are being massacred by these guns.
Well, I think what needs to change is the things that would have the most immediate and succinct effect and tangible effect on these things. And that's actual security at a school. So it's not as if Republicans have...
Look, as part of a compromise package, I would be fine with increased security at a school. But a lot of the ideas that these guys are floating are insane. One of the ones they keep floating is a single point of entry with armed security at the door. But that's a massive fire hazard. And also, it presupposes that the shooting happens from outside of the school and not from within the school, from somebody who sneaks a weapon in and goes to one of the classes. I'm fine with a security guard at various schools. I don't think that's foolproof. I think that there's still going to be issues even with that. The cops just sat outside for an hour in this shooting, so obviously just increased law enforcement is not a good enough answer. I'd be fine with the opposite of what they're claiming, a single point of entry. What if you had a door in every classroom to get out? That seems to me to be more logical than what they're proposing, but ultimately we're dancing around the big question of weapons. And you're never going to see a big decrease in the number of gun deaths until you have some stricter gun laws. I do think it's a reasonable debate. Where do you draw the line in terms of the restrictions? I think that's a fair debate. You're balancing freedom versus security. But clearly where we've drawn the line is kind of insane. That's why we have 39,000 gun deaths a year, and nobody else comes even close to us when it comes to developed countries. Not even close. We're off the charts when it comes to gun deaths and mass shootings and stuff like that. So he just doesn't want to do any of those reforms that poll really well among the American public, like the universal background checks, like a ban on high-capacity magazines, like even a ban on assault weapons is at 63% now. He doesn't want to do any of these things.
Never proposed anything. Again, I went through some earlier, the Fix NICS Act, the 21st Century Fix NICS Act, which is a new proposal. Looking at the Stop Violence in Schools Act, that one actually put resources towards schools, towards school resource officers, increasing the penalties for...
This school in Uvalde, Texas was up to date with all of the mass shooting preparedness and security stuff. So again, this isn't really a good answer at this point in time.
Why not do both? Why are they mutually exclusive?
That's correct. Dan is right on that. Again, I would be willing, as part of a compromise package, I'd be willing to talk about security in schools. I would be willing, they always talk about mental illness, right? I'd be willing to do universal mental health care around this entire country. Every place around this country should have free mental health care. I'm totally for that. Now, I proposed that bill and they vote against it. But if they were serious, yes, I will compromise on some of those things, but they need to compromise on gun reforms. They absolutely need to be in favor of universal background checks and a ban on high-capacity magazines, at the very least. And even then, you'd have a slight reduction in the number of gun deaths, but it wouldn't be anything to write home about. Maybe you go from 39,000 to 26,000, but that's still 26,000 deaths. That's insane, and they're still saying no. And it's because of the NRA money, I should be clear, because a lot of these guys are just flush with NRA cash as they pretend like, this is all... He took $126,000 from the NRA. So that also informs his position of no new gun reforms at all.
Why can't you secure schools and other solutions that have to do with access to guns in a way that respects
because the
Second Amendment and its core and what it was intended as?
Well, that's exactly the problem with it, because a lot of these policies that I think the Democrats often propose that are gun control policies, they do two things. One, they infringe on the rights of millions and millions of gun owners. And two, they probably wouldn't have the outcome that you're hoping for. So if you're not going to get...
It would reduce the number of gun deaths. It wouldn't eliminate them, but it would reduce the number of gun deaths. And reducing it is a reasonable goal if you're trying to balance that with some freedoms around gun ownership. So I think it's the right path. It's the right path. He says, I don't care how many bodies pile up, no restrictions at all, because he has a terrible interpretation of the Second Amendment where he thinks it gives you an ironclad individual right to own a firearm, regardless of any extenuating circumstances. That's not true. There's a reason why the Second Amendment says well-regulated militia, necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. It was about standing armies, a well-regulated militia. And he's arguing people who are not in a well-regulated militia having, the ability to own a firearm with very little to no restrictions, which, by the way, if he was consistent, he should say we should be allowed fully automatic weapons as well.
The benefit that you want, but it's going to come at great cost. That generally means it's not a very good policy. Again, that's why I go back to hardening schools, because it should be fairly easy to afford. We can look at data. We could have this discussion for a while. But
the data is totally against him on this. Totally against him on this. More guns equals more gun violence. That's what the data shows.
The correlation between gun ownership and gun violence is not very strong. It's not as strong as a lot of people tend to believe it is. You have states like New Hampshire and Midwestern states that have extremely lax gun control.
Congressman, it sounds like you're saying that...
Yeah, because there's 7 people in those states. That's such a terrible point.
That guns in this country are not a problem. Is that what you're saying? I mean, there are 300-something million people, 400 million guns. You don't see that as a problem?
No, I mean, I think...
Don't you think that maybe that contributes to why we have so many more gun deaths than every other country? It's just, see, again, that just strikes me as dishonest. What he said there strikes me as dishonest. So, I'll say this for the 100th time, man. I would respect it if people who are really pro-gun or on the right simply said, yes, we have so many guns, and that does lead to more gun deaths. But the freedom to have those weapons, in my mind, is more important than the safety and security you would get from restricting those firearms to one extent or another. Because at least that's an honest argument. But what you get is a lot of people obfuscating and deflecting, or just totally convincing themselves that they're correct in this idea that no, more guns really does equal more peace. And that's just not true, man. That's just not true. So anyway, thank you, Dan Crenshaw, for going on CNN and telling us your response to this mass shooting, and your policy solutions and reforms are... Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.